The cabin was silent, but the tension was suffocating. Dr. Naomi Carter sat upright in her first-class seat, her expression composed yet unwavering, as Colonel Richard Green loomed over her, his face twisted in disbelief and anger. "People like, you don't belong here," he spat, his voice sharp enough to slice through the quiet murmurs of the passengers watching the scene unfold. Naomi didn't flinch. Instead, she calmly took a sip of her champagne and set the glass down with deliberate precision, meeting his furious gaze with a quiet, almost unsettling confidence. The flight attendant hesitated, looking between them, unsure of how to de-escalate the situation. The entire first-class cabin had their eyes locked on Naomi, waiting for her reaction, expecting her to shrink, to submit, to move. But instead, she did something no one expected. She smiled, a slow, knowing smile that made Green's scowl deepen. 12 hours earlier, Naomi had no idea that this flight would test not just her patience, but her very dignity. What had led to this moment? And more importantly, how would it end? Before we dive into this powerful story, let us know where you're watching from in the comments. If you stand for justice and equality, don't forget to hit like and subscribe for more thought-provoking stories like this one. Dr. Naomi Carter rushed through the airport, exhaustion weighing her down like a lead blanket. After an unrelenting 72-hour shift at the hospital, she could feel the effects of sleep deprivation clawing at her body, making every movement sluggish. Her eyes burned, her legs ached, and her mind swam with fragmented thoughts of the last few days. Emergency surgeries, racing heart monitors, the desperate prayers of family members waiting for news, and the bittersweet moments of lives saved and lost. All she wanted now was to get home, take a long shower, and sink into the solace of her own bed. But first, she had to survive the gauntlet of air travel. Pulling her suitcase behind her, she made her way toward the security checkpoint, where a long line of weary travelers snaked through the barriers. She barely noticed the way people subtly glanced at her, some with curiosity, others with skepticism. Naomi was used to the unspoken judgments, to the small but persistent signs that she was an anomaly in spaces like this, but she had neither the time nor the energy to care. As she reached the front of the line, she handed her boarding pass and ID to the security officer, a stocky man with a stern expression who barely glanced at the documents before pausing. He frowned, scrutinizing her ID longer than necessary, flipping it back and forth as though expecting to find something wrong. Naomi remained patient, though she felt a familiar prickle of irritation creeping up her spine. "Is there a problem?" she asked, her voice calm but firm. The officer looked at her again, then back at the ID, his eyes narrowing slightly. "You're a doctor?" The question was laced with doubt, as though the very idea was improbable. Naomi inhaled slowly. "Yes, I am." He didn't hand the ID back immediately. Instead, he glanced at her attire, dark jeans, a fitted blazer over a simple blouse, a duffel bag slung over her shoulder. Nothing flashy, nothing out of place. Still, something in his expression told her he was second-guessing her presence in the priority lane. "Where you headed?" he asked, his tone far more inquisitive than it had been for the passengers before her. Naomi forced herself to keep her posture relaxed. "Boston." He pursed his lips, then, almost reluctantly, handed her ID back. "Go ahead," he muttered. Naomi exhaled, taking the documents and stepping forward. She told herself it wasn't a big deal, that she was used to this, that she had experienced worse. But the sting of it lingered as she placed her bag on the conveyor belt and moved through the scanner. As she retrieved her belongings, she heard another passenger breeze through security with barely a glance from the same officer, a man in a tailored suit who hadn't even been asked to show ID. Naomi clenched her jaw and kept walking. She wasn't about to let a moment of casual bias ruin her trip, though she knew deep down that this was only the beginning. By the time she reached her gate, fatigue was pressing down on her so heavily that she barely heard her name being called over the intercom. She blinked in surprise as she approached the counter. "Dr. Carter?" The flight attendant behind the desk smiled at her, though it was the rehearsed, professional kind of smile that didn't quite reach the eyes. "You've been upgraded to first class." Naomi hesitated, momentarily thrown. "I have?" The attendant nodded. "Yes, it looks like a complimentary upgrade due to your status with the airline." Naomi wasn't sure whether to feel relieved or suspicious. She had flown with this airline plenty of times and never received an upgrade before, but she wasn't about to question good fortune. "Thank you," she said, taking the new boarding pass and moving aside to wait for boarding. A few minutes later, as she stood near the gate, she felt the weight of eyes on her, subtle, yet undeniable. She glanced around and caught the looks, quick, assessing, some outright questioning. First class wasn't where people expected her to be, and they weren't subtle about it. Naomi ignored them, keeping her focus on her phone as she waited for the boarding announcement. When it was finally time to board, she walked down the jet bridge, rolling her suitcase behind her, doing her best to suppress the overwhelming exhaustion pressing at the edges of her consciousness. As she stepped onto the plane, she felt a flicker of discomfort as she moved past rows of well-dressed businessmen and luxury travelers who barely glanced at her, until she reached the first-class section. The difference was immediate. The moment she entered, the subtle shift in atmosphere was impossible to ignore. Naomi wasn't oblivious to the unspoken hierarchy of airline seating, and first class was often an unspoken members-only club, one she wasn't expected to belong to. She could feel it in the quick glances, the small frowns, the way some passengers straightened slightly in their seats as she walked by. A flight attendant, a tall blonde woman in a pressed uniform, intercepted her as she moved toward her seat. "Can I see your boarding pass?" she asked, her tone polite but tinged with something else. Naomi's fingers tightened around her bag. "Sure," she said, handing it over. The attendant studied it for longer than necessary before nodding and stepping aside. "Right this way, Dr. Carter." Naomi nodded, taking the ticket back and moving forward, but the moment stuck with her. It wasn't just protocol. It was hesitation. As she reached her seat, she exhaled slowly, placing her bag in the overhead compartment, and finally sinking into the plush leather seat. A rare luxury. She closed her eyes for a moment, allowing herself to enjoy the brief reprieve from the chaos of the past few days. The quiet hum of the cabin, the soft lighting, the promise of a smooth flight home. It should have been a moment of peace. But as she opened her eyes, she noticed something. A man sitting across from her, in his 60s, with a rigid posture and an unmistakable air of authority, was watching her. His gaze wasn't merely curious, it was sharp, assessing, and filled with something she recognized all too well: Colonel Richard Green. His neatly pressed military-style jacket bore insignias that spoke of years of service, and the way he sat, back straight, shoulders squared, suggested he was someone used to being in control. His eyes, however, betrayed something else: disapproval. Naomi had seen that look before, countless times in different settings, from different faces, but always with the same message. "You don't belong here." She held his gaze for a moment before turning her attention to her phone, refusing to engage. She had no interest in whatever silent battle he thought he was starting, but the moment of reprieve was short-lived. Just as she was about to settle in, a shadow loomed over her, and when she looked up, Colonel Green was standing by her seat, his expression hard, his voice low and firm. "There must be some mistake," he said, his tone edged with disbelief. Naomi blinked, confused for a split second before realizing exactly what was happening. "Excuse me?" she asked, her voice even. "This is first class," Green said, as if that explained everything. Naomi stared at him, feeling the weight of every microaggression she had endured over the years boiling under the surface, but she refused to let it show. "Yes, it is," she said, her voice calm but unyielding. Green frowned deeper. "Then why are you sitting here?" The words hit like a slap, not because they surprised her, but because of the sheer audacity of them. She felt the attention of the nearby passengers, felt the silent anticipation in the air. People were waiting to see what would happen next. Naomi took a measured breath before speaking. "Because this is my seat," she said simply, reaching into her pocket and producing her boarding pass. She held it up without breaking eye contact. The colonel's eyes flicked to the pass, then back to her. He didn't take it, he didn't need to. His face twisted slightly, his lips pressing into a thin line. "You sure about that?" he muttered, almost to himself. Naomi had dealt with this kind of arrogance before. She had seen it in patients who doubted her qualifications, in colleagues who assumed she was a nurse rather than a surgeon, in strangers who believed people like her could only get ahead through charity or mistake. She had learned long ago not to let it shake her. "Quite sure," she replied smoothly. But Green wasn't ready to back down. He turned toward the approaching flight attendant, raising a hand to flag her down. "Miss, there seems to be a problem," he said, his voice carrying an edge of authority. The flight attendant paused, looking between them. Naomi could already see the hesitation in her stance, the way she hesitated to challenge the colonel outright. "What seems to be the issue?" the attendant asked, carefully neutral. Green gestured toward Naomi. "I believe this seat might have been assigned incorrectly." Naomi narrowed her eyes, gripping the armrest a little tighter. She could already feel where this was heading, and she wasn't about to let it go unchallenged. The air in the cabin grew heavier, the unspoken tensions thickening like a storm on the horizon. And in that moment, Naomi realized that this flight was going to be far longer than she had anticipated. Naomi felt the heat of the moment pressing against her like a smothering weight, but she refused to break her composure. The flight attendant looked between her and Colonel Green, clearly uncomfortable, but hesitant to challenge the authority exuding from the older man. Naomi, however, was in no mood for diplomacy. "This is my seat," she repeated, her voice unwavering, holding up her boarding pass for the attendant to confirm. Green's scowl deepened, his lips curling into a sneer as he crossed his arms over his chest. "I don't think so," he muttered under his breath, though loud enough for nearby passengers to hear. Naomi caught the flicker of amusement in the eyes of a businessman seated across the aisle, the way a woman a few rows ahead discreetly turned her head as though she wanted no part in what was about to unfold. The flight attendant hesitated for only a second before taking Naomi's boarding pass and glancing at it. Her eyes quickly scanned the seat assignment, and then, without a word, she turned to Green. "Sir, her ticket is correct. She is in A." There was a moment of silence where Green's expression hardened into something almost unreadable. Then, as if the words themselves were an insult, he scoffed and shook his head. "There's no way that's right," he said, his voice laced with condescension. "First class is meant for those who've earned it, not just anyone." Naomi felt a sharp pulse of irritation, but she kept her posture relaxed, even as her grip on the armrest tightened. "I see," she said slowly, tilting her head as she regarded him. "And you assume I haven't earned it?" The colonel's jaw tightened. "I don't assume. I know." There it was. The quiet part said aloud, the finality in his voice, the certainty that a black woman in first class was an impossibility, unless some mistake had been made. The weight of his words settled like a thick fog over the cabin. Naomi had spent years perfecting the art of self-restraint, of choosing her battles wisely, but she wasn't about to let this moment slip away unchecked. "I see," she said again, softer this time, as though she were weighing her words. "And what exactly have you done to earn this seat?" Green's nostrils flared. "I served this country," he snapped. "I fought for its freedoms. I sacrificed for it." His voice was loud enough that more passengers began paying attention, their heads subtly turning, their gazes darting between them like spectators at a silent match. Naomi exhaled through her nose, nodding slightly. "I respect that," she said evenly. "But tell me something, Colonel. Did you fight so that only some people could enjoy those freedoms? Or did you fight for all of us?" The question landed like a punch. The muscles in Green's jaw twitched, and for a fleeting second, uncertainty flickered in his eyes. But then, as if remembering who he was, his expression darkened once more. "Don't twist my words," he said, voice dripping with irritation. This isn't about that. This is about facts. And the fact is, first class isn't for people like you. The words struck with a familiar sting, but Naomi had faced worse. She sat back in her seat, crossing her legs, refusing to rise to his. People like me, she repeated, as though testing the weight of the words. And what exactly does that mean? Green shifted uncomfortably but refused to back down. You know exactly what it means, he muttered. Naomi led the way. Silence stretched between them, refusing to let him rush past his own admission. The air grew heavier, the tension thick enough to suffocate. She didn't need to spell it out. He already had. This wasn't about class, service, or sacrifice. This was about race, about who belonged and who didn't. Naomi turned her gaze toward the flight attendant, who was standing awkwardly, her hands clasped in front of her, as though she were hoping the situation would resolve itself. I'd like to get back to my flight now, Naomi said, her voice cool but firm. The flight attendant hesitated, then nodded quickly. Of course, Dr. Carter. Naomi caught the briefest flicker of recognition in the woman's eyes, the realization dawning that she had made an assumption too. Dr. Carter. Not Ms. Carter, not Miss, a doctor. The title held weight. Even so, Green wasn't ready to accept defeat. There has to be a mistake, he muttered one last time, though the fight in his voice was beginning to waver. Naomi leaned forward slightly, lowering her voice just enough so that only he could hear. The only mistake, she said quietly, is assuming I don't deserve to be here just because it makes you uncomfortable. Green didn't respond. He only stared at her, something unreadable flickering in his expression before he straightened and turned sharply on his heel. He marched toward the back of first class, presumably toward his actual seat, but Naomi could still feel the burn of his glare lingering on her. As she settled back into her seat, a quiet murmur passed through the passengers. Some avoided her gaze, while others exchanged brief glances with one another, as though debating whether they should say something. No one did. Naomi sighed, lifting her glass of champagne and taking a slow sip. She had won this round, but something told her the battle wasn't over. If anything, it had just begun. What would you have done in Naomi's place? Comment number 1 if you agree that she handled it the right way, or let us know how you would have responded. And if you support fairness and equality, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and spark conversations. But was this the last of Colonel Green's interference? Or was this just the beginning of something even bigger? Stay tuned. Naomi exhaled, willing her body to relax despite the tight coil of tension still wound inside her. She had faced these moments before, the subtle and not-so-subtle ways people questioned her presence, her legitimacy, her very right to exist, in certain spaces. But no matter how often it happened, it never stopped being exhausting. She could still feel the residual weight of Colonel Green's glare, the sharp edges of his indignation slicing through the air as he stalked toward his actual seat a few rows back. The flight attendant, sensing the shift in atmosphere, offered Naomi a tight-lipped smile before disappearing down the aisle, clearly eager to remove herself from the situation. Naomi turned her gaze to the window, hoping to find solace in the sky outside, but she could still sense the eyes on her. The businessman across the aisle shifted in his seat, his expression unreadable, while the middle-aged woman 2 rows ahead kept glancing back as if expecting something else to happen. Naomi took a slow breath and forced herself to refocus. The flight hadn't even taken off yet, and she already felt drained. Just as she was beginning to settle, the flight attendant returned, a careful mask of neutrality on her face as she stopped beside Naomi's seat. Dr. Carter, may I speak with you for a moment? Naomi's stomach tightened. She knew that tone. It was the same tone she had heard from professors who questioned whether she had actually written her own research papers, from hospital administrators, who had subtly suggested she should adjust her approach to dealing with certain patients, from gate agents who asked her to step aside for random security checks. It was the tone of forced politeness, the kind that barely masked a deeper issue. Naomi turned to her, keeping her expression unreadable. Is there a problem? The flight attendant hesitated, her hands clasped neatly in front of her. It's just that some of the other passengers have expressed concerns. Naomi's jaw clenched. Concerns about what? The woman shifted slightly, clearly uncomfortable. About the disruption earlier. Some are feeling uneasy, and we just want to make sure everyone is comfortable before we take off. The words landed like a slap. Naomi let them settle for a moment before responding. And how exactly am I making them uncomfortable? The flight attendant swallowed. It's not you, personally, Dr. Carter. It's just that tensions were high and some passengers are feeling unsettled. Naomi stared at her, letting the weight of what was being said settle between them. It wasn't Colonel Green who was being addressed. It wasn't the businessman who had chuckled, or the woman who had suggested she might be more comfortable in coach. It was her. She was the disruption. She was the one making people uneasy, simply by existing in a space they had decided wasn't meant for her. Naomi could feel the heat rising in her chest, but she refused to give them the satisfaction of seeing her anger. Instead, she tilted her head slightly and offered the flight attendant a cool, measured look. I see, she said, her voice level. So, let me get this straight. A man publicly questioned my right to be here. He humiliated me, accused me of taking a seat I didn't deserve, and yet, I'm the one you're speaking to about making passengers uncomfortable. The flight attendant's lips pressed together. She was clearly regretting this conversation, but it was too late to back out now. Naomi could see it, the flicker of doubt, the realization that she had walked straight into an indefensible position. Still, the woman didn't back down. I understand how you feel, Dr. Carter. We just want to ensure a smooth flight for everyone. Naomi exhaled sharply through her nose, shaking her head. I'm sure you do. She could feel her heart pounding, her fingers curling slightly against the armrest. The injustice of it all sat like a stone in her chest, heavy and immovable. She had done nothing wrong, and yet she was being asked to accommodate the discomfort of those who had. The flight attendant hesitated for a second longer, before nodding stiffly and stepping away. Naomi watched her retreat, the tension in her muscles refusing to ease. As she turned back toward the window, she caught a glimpse of movement from the corner of her eye. Colonel Green was watching her from his seat a few rows back, his expression unreadable. He had heard everything. Naomi refused to look away first. For a long moment, they simply stared at each other, an unspoken challenge hanging in the space between them. Then, slowly, Green smirked, shaking his head slightly before turning his attention elsewhere, as if dismissing her entirely. Naomi forced herself to take a slow breath. She had spent years learning how to navigate moments like this, how to pick her battles, how to let things roll off her back. But this time, something about it felt different. This time, she wasn't sure she could simply move on. The plane began to taxi, and Naomi tried to focus on the journey ahead, but the energy in the cabin remained thick with unspoken tension. The businessman across the aisle finally spoke, his voice casual but laced with something else. Rough start to the flight, huh? Naomi turned to look at him, her expression carefully neutral. You could say that. He nodded, taking a sip of his drink before offering her a small, knowing smile. First time in first class? The words were innocent enough on the surface, but Naomi knew better. She had learned to recognize the subtle ways people tested her, prodded at her, presence to see how she would react. She met his gaze evenly. Not at all. His smile didn't waver, but there was something in his eyes, a flicker of amusement, of curiosity. Ah, well, I'm sure it'll be a smooth flight from here on out. Naomi wasn't so sure. The plane ascended. She tried to push the encounter from her mind, but she couldn't shake the feeling that this wasn't over. And she was right. Less than an hour into the flight, a flight attendant returned with a quiet request that she accompany them to the back of the cabin. Naomi frowned, suspicion creeping into her gut. Why? She asked, keeping her voice even. The attendant hesitated before responding. The captain would like to have a word with you. Naomi's pulse quickened. The captain. This was different. This was something more. She stood slowly, the eyes of nearby passengers following her. Movements. As she walked past Green's seat, she caught the faintest hint of satisfaction in his expression. And suddenly, she understood. This wasn't just about him. This was bigger. Naomi lifted her chin and squared her shoulders. If they thought they could intimidate her, they were wrong. She had worked too hard, fought too long to let anyone make her feel small. As she reached the back of the plane, she was met by a uniformed TSA officer, his stance firm and authoritative. "Dr. Carter," he said, his voice clipped. "We received a report of a passenger causing a disturbance in first class." Naomi felt her stomach drop, a slow, simmering anger rising in its place. A disturbance. She had been sitting in her seat minding her own business, and now she was being treated like a problem, like a threat. She took a slow breath, forcing herself to remain calm. "A disturbance," she repeated. "May I ask who made this report?" The TSA officer didn't answer immediately, which told her everything she needed to know. Naomi crossed, her arms refusing to be intimidated. "Let me guess," she said, her voice steady. "An older white gentleman who didn't like that I was in first class?" The officer didn't confirm, but his silence was all the answer she needed. Naomi felt a slow, bitter smile curve her lips. "You know," she said, tilting her head slightly, "I've spent years saving lives, people from all walks of life. Soldiers, civilians, men, women, children. I don't ask them who they voted for, what they believe, or where they think I belong. I just do my job. But somehow, when I sit in first class, I'm treated like I don't deserve to be here. Funny how that works, isn't it?" The TSA officer shifted, clearly uncomfortable, but before he could respond, another voice cut through the tension. "Is there a problem here?" Naomi turned, surprised to see another first-class passenger, a middle-aged woman with sharp eyes and an expensive suit, stepping forward. "Because from where I'm standing, it looks like Dr. Carter has done nothing wrong." Naomi blinked. The woman's tone was clipped, firm, and filled with authority. The TSA officer hesitated before, sighing. "There's no problem," he said, his voice less certain now. Naomi lifted an eyebrow. "Good," she said simply, before turning on her heel and walking back to her seat. As she passed Green, she saw something flicker in his expression. Something like uncertainty. Naomi didn't say a word. She didn't need to. She simply sat back in her seat and picked up her champagne, sipping it slowly as the flight continued on, knowing deep down that this wasn't over yet. Naomi could feel the pulse of tension still vibrating through the cabin as she settled back into her seat, gripping the armrests just a little tighter than before. She took a slow, deliberate breath, her heartbeat pounding in her ears as she tried to center herself. This wasn't new, this wasn't unexpected, but it didn't make it any less exhausting. The quiet whispers from the passengers, the subtle side glances, the stiff posture of those around her, they were all remnants of what had just happened. The encounter with the TSA officer still simmered beneath her skin, a slow burn of frustration that refused to fade. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew what had happened back there wasn't just a random misunderstanding. It had been deliberate, calculated. Colonel Green had set a trap, and the airline had nearly fallen for it. She had nearly been forced into the humiliating position of defending her very presence in a space she rightfully belonged to. But she had stood her ground, and now, as the flight hummed along through the sky, she wondered if the battle was truly over, or if the next strike was already being prepared. She adjusted her posture, forcing her shoulders to relax as she reached for her glass of water. Just as she lifted it, a voice cut through the silence like a razor. Unbelievable. Naomi's grip tightened around the glass as she slowly turned her head, her gaze locking onto Colonel Green, who sat a few rows behind her, his expression twisted with unfiltered contempt. He wasn't even trying to hide it anymore. "The world's gone soft," he muttered, just loud enough for those nearby to hear. "Back in my day, people earned their way into places like this. They didn't just get handed things. Naomi could feel the weight of the words pressing against her skin like a slow, suffocating force. He wanted her to react. He wanted her to lose her composure. But she wouldn't give him that satisfaction. She took a slow sip of water, setting the glass down with careful precision before turning in her seat to face him. "Is that so?" she said, her voice calm but sharp. Green's lips curled into something that might have been a smirk if it weren't laced with such obvious disdain. "That's right," he said. "But I guess things are different now. People can just complain their way into first class." Naomi's fingers flexed against her knee, but her expression remained neutral. "Or," she said smoothly, "people can work hard, save lives, and still be questioned by men who assume they know better." A murmur rippled through the nearby seats. A few passengers shifted uncomfortably, while others leaned in slightly, intrigued by the brewing confrontation. Green scoffed, shaking his head as he leaned back. "Sure," he said. "You expect me to believe that?" His voice carried, just enough mockery to make Naomi's jaw tighten. "A woman like you, a doctor? Give me a break." The words hit like a slap. Naomi had faced doubt before. Patients who questioned her credentials. Colleagues who assumed she was a nurse before a surgeon. Strangers who believed success for someone like her had to be the result of a diversity quota rather than skill. But hearing it so blatantly, so unapologetically, made her stomach twist. Before she could respond, another voice cut in. "I'm sorry, but did you just say, a woman like you?" The interruption came from across the aisle. Naomi turned her head slightly, finding herself face to face with a woman in her 40s, dressed in an expensive blazer with a sharpness. Her eyes that suggested she had spent years dismantling men like Green in boardrooms. "Because I'd love for you to clarify exactly what you meant by that." Green's mouth opened slightly, as if caught off guard by the direct challenge. "You're twisting my words," he grumbled. The woman raised an eyebrow. "Am I? Because it sounded an awful lot like you were questioning whether Dr. Carter was actually a doctor. Based on what exactly? The fact that she's a woman or something else?" A ripple of tension passed through the cabin. Some passengers had started to pay closer attention now, their gazes flickering between Naomi and Green like they were watching a slow-burning explosion unfold. Naomi could see the way Green's fingers tightened on the armrest, the way his jaw clenched as he realized the tides were shifting. But before he could formulate a response, the businessman from earlier let out a quiet chuckle. "It's funny," he said, tapping his fingers against the armrest. "A guy like you, a veteran, should understand better than anyone what it means to fight for your place. But instead of respecting someone else who's done the same, you're sitting here whining because a black woman in first class makes you uncomfortable." A sharp silence followed. Naomi's breath caught slightly at the bluntness of the statement, and for the first time she saw something shift in Green's expression. A flicker of something deeper, something raw. But it was gone just as quickly as it came, he scoffed, shaking his head. "You people always make it about race," he muttered under his breath. Naomi exhaled slowly, feeling the exhaustion settle deeper into her bones. She could argue, she could push back, but she had spent years learning that some battles weren't worth the energy. Some people didn't want to understand, they just wanted to be angry, and Green was one of them. But then, just as she was about to turn away, something unexpected happened. "James wouldn't have stood for this." The words were soft, barely audible, but Naomi heard them, and from the way Green's posture stiffened, she knew he hadn't meant to say them out loud. Her head tilted slightly, curiosity flickering in her gaze. "James?" she asked. Green's throat worked as he swallowed, as if debating whether to answer. Then, after a long pause, he exhaled sharply. "A man I served with," he said, his voice quieter now, almost reluctant. Naomi studied him carefully. "A black man?" Green's eyes flickered to her sharply, but he didn't deny it. Naomi sat back slightly, letting the weight of the moment settle. "And what would James have thought about this?" she asked. "About the way you're acting right now?" Green's mouth pressed into a thin line. He didn't answer. He didn't have to. Naomi could see the internal war playing out in his eyes, the way something old and painful twisted beneath his expression. This wasn't just about her. It never had been. This was about something deeper, something unresolved. The businessman across the aisle let out a quiet hum, tapping his fingers against the seat. "You know, I had a mentor once," he said conversationally. "Taught me everything I know. He used to say that a man's true character isn't in how he fights, but in how he grows. How he learns." He turned his head slightly, meeting Green's gaze. "You still capable of that, Colonel?" The question lingered in the air, heavy and unspoken. Green didn't answer immediately. His gaze flickered toward Naomi, something unreadable in his expression. Then, without a word, he turned away. Naomi wasn't sure what that meant. If it was surrender or just retreat. But either way, it felt like a shift, a fracture in the unmovable. What do you think? Do people like Colonel Green ever change? Comment number 1. If you believe people can grow from their prejudices, or let us know if you think some people never truly learn. And if you stand for equality, don't forget to like and subscribe for more stories that challenge perspectives and spark conversations. But was this truly the end of the conflict? Or was there still one final reckoning to come? Stay tuned. Naomi sat motionless in her seat, her fingers lightly tracing the rim of her untouched water glass, her mind still turning over the unexpected shift in Colonel Green's expression. She had seen men like him before, rigid, unyielding, certain in their prejudices, but she had also seen the flicker of something else in his eyes just now. Regret? Recognition? It was impossible to tell. The cabin had grown quieter since the confrontation, the air thick with lingering tension, though most of the passengers had now retreated into their own worlds. The businessman across the aisle had leaned back in his seat, arms folded in satisfaction, while the woman who had spoken up earlier was now casually flipping through a magazine. Even the flight attendants seemed determined to pretend nothing had happened, their smiles more forced than ever as they moved through the aisles, performing their duties with extra precision. Naomi exhaled slowly, willing her shoulders to relax, telling herself it was over. But something in her gut told her otherwise. This wasn't over. Not yet. As the flight continued, Naomi tried to lose herself in her work, pulling out her tablet and scrolling through unread emails, her mind attempting to latch onto the familiarity of medical reports and patient updates. But her focus was fractured, and every so often she felt the weight of a stare pressing into her skin. She ignored it at first, thinking it was just residual paranoia from the earlier altercation. But after the third or fourth time she glanced up and found Green watching her. His gaze wasn't as hard as before, nor as openly hostile, but there was something in it that made her pulse quicken. Something unresolved. Naomi held his stare for a moment, daring him to say something, but he only blinked, then looked away. The moment stretched between them like a taut wire, neither one willing to cut it. The flight attendant reappeared with refreshments, her hands carefully steady as she offered Naomi a refill of her drink. Naomi hesitated for a second before nodding, watching as the woman poured the liquid with practiced ease. Then, just as the attendant moved away, Green finally spoke. "You remind me of him." Naomi looked up, startled by the suddenness of his voice. He wasn't looking at her directly, his gaze fixed on something in the distance, but there was no mistaking who he was talking to. She set her tablet down slowly. "James?" she asked, keeping her voice neutral. Green's fingers twitched, slightly where they rested on his lap. "Yeah," he muttered. "James." Naomi studied him carefully. There was something different in his posture now, something less sure, less solid. He wasn't the same man who had barked at her to move, who had spoken with the certainty of someone who had never questioned his own worldview. This was someone else. Someone older, wearier, someone carrying the weight of something long buried. "What happened to him?" she asked quietly. Green exhaled, his jaw working as if he was trying to hold something back. For a long moment he didn't answer, and Naomi thought he might refuse entirely. But then, finally, he spoke. We served together in Vietnam, he said, his voice rough like gravel beneath tires. He was one of the best men I ever knew, smarter than most of us, better than most of us too. He let out a humorless chuckle, shaking his head. Didn't matter though, not to some people. Naomi felt something cold settle in her stomach. She had heard stories, countless ones, of black soldiers who had fought for a country that refused to fight for them in return, who had faced more hostility from their own so-called comrades than from the enemy they had been sent to defeat. She had read about it in history books, in old war journals, in articles buried beneath more palatable narratives. But hearing it now, from a man who had likely been part of that system, made it feel heavier, more real. They didn't respect him, she said, more a statement than a question. Green let out a slow breath, his fingers tightening around the armrest. They tolerated him, he admitted, until they didn't. The words hung between them, unspoken but understood. Naomi felt her chest tighten. What happened to him? She asked again, softer this time. Green's throat worked as he swallowed. He saved my life, he said finally. Took a bullet, meant for me. His voice cracked just slightly, and for the first time Naomi saw it. The pain, the guilt, the weight of decades of silence. And then, he continued, voice quieter now, when we got back home, I tried to honor him. I really did. Talked about what he did. Tried to make sure people knew his name, but no one cared. No medals, no honors, no recognition. It was like he never existed. He let out a bitter laugh, shaking his head. And I let it happen. I let them erase him. Naomi's breath caught in her throat. She had expected many things from this. Flight, indifference, anger, even hostility, but not this. Not this raw, open wound buried beneath the years of bitterness. And now, she asked quietly, now you take that anger out on people like me? Green flinched slightly, as if struck. He didn't respond immediately, and when he did, his voice was tight. Maybe, he admitted. Or maybe I just forgot what I was supposed to be fighting for. Naomi studied him, her mind turning over. His words. She had spent years battling people like him, proving herself over and over again in spaces that had never been designed for her to succeed. And yet, as she looked at the man in front of her, she realized that he wasn't just an adversary. He was something else, something more complicated, a man who had once believed in something greater, only to let it slip away in the haze of resentment and regret. And for the first time since this flight began, she saw not just an opponent, but a man at war with himself. The hum of the plane's engines filled the silence between them, a quiet but constant reminder that time was moving forward, whether they liked it or not. Naomi could have left it there. She could have nodded, turned back to her tablet, and let the conversation end. But something in her refused to let it go. It's not too late, you know, she said after a long pause. Green frowned, his eyes narrowing slightly. Too late for what? Naomi met his gaze steadily. To do something about it. Green let out a slow, shaky breath, as if the idea itself was foreign to him. And what exactly do you suggest? He asked, his voice almost wary. Naomi tilted her head slightly. You said people forgot him, that they erased his name. So, don't let them. She leaned forward just slightly, her voice steady. Tell his story, make people remember. Green didn't respond right away, his eyes flickering with something Naomi couldn't quite name. Uncertainty? Fear? Hope? Whatever it was enough to keep him from dismissing her outright. He nodded slowly, almost absently, as if testing the weight of the idea in his mind. James always said we were fighting for something bigger than ourselves, he murmured. I used to believe that once. Naomi offered him a small, knowing smile. Then believe it again. For the first time, Green didn't have a retort. He didn't scoff or roll his eyes or mutter something under his breath. He simply sat, there, silent, thoughtful, the walls he had spent years fortifying beginning to crack. And for the first time since this flight began, Naomi allowed herself to hope. Maybe, just maybe, some battles were still worth fighting. Naomi sat back in her seat, watching as Green stared ahead, his expression unreadable, his fingers tapping restlessly against the armrest. The silence between them stretched long, thick with unspoken words. Yet for the first time since this flight began, it was not a silence born of tension or hostility. It was something else, something raw, something uncertain. She could feel the weight of his thoughts pressing into the space between them, the heavy burden of whatever ghost he had been carrying all these years beginning to stir. The hum of the plane's engines filled the void, a steady reminder of the passage of time, of movement, of the inevitability of forward momentum, whether either of them was ready for it or not. Naomi knew better than to push too hard, too fast. This kind of realization, the kind that shattered the carefully constructed walls of belief, was not something that could be forced. It had to come on its own, settle into the cracks, seep through like water finding the weakest point in a dam. She remained still, allowing the moment to breathe, to settle into itself, waiting for him to speak first. And eventually he did. "I never thought I'd be sitting here having this conversation," Green muttered, more to himself than to her. His voice was quieter now, stripped of the earlier bravado. The sharp edges of authority dulled into something far more human. "Hell, I never thought I'd even be questioning any of this." His hand lifted slightly as if gesturing to the space between them, to the intangible thing that had shifted, then fell back into his lap. He exhaled, shaking his head. "I spent years believing I had it all figured out, that I knew what this country was, what it stood for, who deserved what. And now," his voice trailed off, and for a long moment he simply sat there, his mouth pressing into a thin line as he searched for the right words. "Now, I don't know what the hell to think anymore." Naomi considered him carefully. There was a time when she would have dismissed a statement like that, would have seen it as nothing more than a convenient, temporary lapse in conviction that would inevitably harden again once the moment passed. But something about Green's voice, about the way his shoulders had lost their squared rigidity, told her that this was different. He was standing at the precipice of something, and he didn't quite know whether to step forward or fall back, into the comfort of old certainties. She didn't know whether he would ever truly change, whether this conversation would be the beginning of something, or just a fleeting moment of doubt before he retreated once more into his old way of thinking. But she had seen enough in her life to know that change, real, lasting change, never came all at once. It was slow, messy. It came in pieces in moments like these, where the cracks in a person's beliefs became just wide enough for something new to slip through. She glanced down at the tray table in front of her, running a fingertip absently, along the edge of the glass sitting atop it. "I don't expect you to figure it all out in one night," she said finally, her voice steady, even. "Hell, I don't expect you to figure it out at all if you don't want to. That's on you. That's your decision." She looked up, meeting his gaze, holding it. "But I will say this. Understanding isn't about having all the answers. It's about being willing to ask the right questions, and it seems to me like, for the first time in a long time, you're finally asking them." Green let out a breath that sounded almost like a bitter laugh, shaking his head again, this time with something that almost resembled amusement. "You're something else, you know that," he muttered, glancing at her sideways. "I can see why you're a surgeon. You've got a way of cutting right through the bullshit." Naomi smirked faintly. Occupational hazard. For the first time since they boarded this flight, Green's lips twitched into something that almost looked like a smile. It was brief, barely there, but it was something, a crack in the foundation. A glimpse of the man he might have been before the years hardened him into someone else entirely. The conversation lapsed into a more comfortable silence after that, the unspoken hostility between them replaced with something more introspective, more uncertain. Naomi wasn't naive. She knew that one conversation wouldn't undo a lifetime of beliefs. She knew that Green would leave this plane and go back to a world that had reinforced his thinking for decades, that the weight of his old prejudices might be too deeply ingrained to ever be fully erased. But she also knew that for the first Time and years he had been forced to confront something he had long buried, and that alone was enough. As the plane began its descent, the flight attendants moved through the cabin, making their final rounds, ensuring everything was in order. Naomi reached for her belongings, her movements slow, deliberate, as she allowed herself a moment to reflect on everything that had transpired. She had boarded this flight expecting nothing more than exhaustion and a desperate need for rest. Instead, she had found herself in a battle of wills, a clash of perspectives, a conversation she never could have predicted. And somehow, against all odds, it had led to this, a quiet understanding, however fragile, however uncertain. As the landing gear deployed and the city lights below came into view, Green shifted beside her, clearing his throat. "Listen," he started, then hesitated, his voice gruff, as if the words themselves were difficult to push out. Naomi glanced at him, waiting. He sighed. "I don't know if any of this means anything. I don't know if it changes a damn thing. But I do know that I was wrong. About you, about a lot of things." He shifted slightly in his seat, uncomfortable but determined. "And I'm sorry." Naomi studied him for a long moment, then nodded once. "Apology accepted." Green swallowed, then exhaled sharply. "James would have liked you," he muttered after a beat, almost as an afterthought. "Would have said you had guts." Naomi felt something tighten in her chest, but she kept her expression steady. "Sounds like James was a good man." "The best," Green admitted quietly. The plane touched down with a soft jolt. The runway, lights flashing past the window in quick succession. As they taxied toward the gate, passengers began unbuckling their seatbelts, stretching, reaching for overhead bins. Naomi took her time gathering her things, not in a rush to join the chaotic shuffle of deplaning. When she finally stood, she glanced over at Green one last time. He was staring down at something in his hands, an old, worn business card, its edges frayed from years of handling. Before she could ask, he turned and held it out to her. "If you ever need anything," he said, his voice quieter now, more certain. "Or if you just want to talk, reach out." Naomi looked at the card for a second, then took it, her fingers brushing against the rough paper. "I'll keep that in mind." They parted ways without another word, stepping off the plane and into their separate lives. But as Naomi walked through the terminal, the weight of the business card still resting in her palm, she couldn't help but think that, somehow, against all odds, something had shifted. Something had changed, not just in Green, but in her too. Maybe the world didn't change in grand, sweeping gestures. Maybe it changed in moments like these. Small, quiet, unexpected. Maybe that was enough. Maybe that was everything. Naomi walked through the terminal, the distant murmur of conversations and the rhythmic whir of suitcase wheels filling the air around her. The weight of the old business card in her palm felt heavier than it should have, as if it carried more than just an invitation. It carried the burden of a man's guilt, the remnants of a past he had tried to bury beneath decades of resentment. She could still see the way Green had looked at her before handing it over, as if unsure whether to offer it at all, as if part of him still resisted the idea that this moment had changed something fundamental within him. And maybe it hadn't. Maybe, once he left this airport and returned to the world that had shaped him, he would slip back into the comfort of his old ways. But maybe not. Maybe something had cracked, something irreversible, something that would gnaw at him long after this flight became just another memory. Naomi exhaled and slipped the card into the side pocket of her bag, unsure whether she would ever use it, unsure whether it even mattered. What did matter was that for the first time in a long time, she had seen someone confronted by their own reflection, and for once, they hadn't looked away. She continued toward the baggage claim, her pace steady but unhurried. The exhaustion from her 72-hour shift still clung to her like a second skin. But there was something else now, something she couldn't quite name. A kind of weightless clarity, a strange sense of resolution, though she wasn't entirely sure what had been resolved. As she reached the carousel, she caught sight of her duffel bag rotating toward her, and stepped forward, lifting it with ease. Just as she was about to turn away, her phone buzzed in her pocket. She pulled it out and glanced at the screen, an email from one of her colleagues at the hospital. Naomi opened it, scanning the contents quickly. A patient she had operated on just days before, an elderly veteran who had suffered complications from surgery, had made an unexpected recovery. The message was brief, but the gratitude in it was palpable. She felt the tightness in her chest loosen slightly, a small smile ghosting her lips. This was why she did what she did. This was what mattered. As she moved toward the exit, she felt the familiar eyes of strangers glancing her way. The same unspoken questions, the same silent assessments. Was she supposed to be here? Did she belong? Naomi had spent years answering those questions with her actions, with her resilience, with the quiet, undeniable truth of her presence. And now, after everything that had happened on that flight, after everything Green had forced her to relive, she found that she wasn't carrying the weight of it the way she usually did. Maybe because for once she had seen the other side of it, the cracks, the doubt, the space where change could happen. It wasn't a victory, not in the way people often imagined them. But maybe it was enough. She stepped outside into the crisp, evening air, the city buzzing around her, alive and pulsing with movement. Naomi took a deep breath, inhaling the sharp, cool scent of impending rain. She hailed a cab, sliding into the back seat as the driver offered her a polite nod. "Where to?" he asked, his voice deep and steady. Naomi hesitated for half a second, before giving him her address, then settled against the seat, her eyes flickering briefly to the skyline stretching out in front of her. Her phone buzzed again, and this time, she didn't ignore it. Another message, but this one wasn't from a colleague. It was from an unknown number. She frowned slightly, opening it with a flick of her thumb. "Dr. Carter, I don't expect you to reply, but I wanted to say something I should have said a long time ago. Thank you. Not just for the conversation, but for reminding me of something I forgot. I don't know what I'll do with it yet, but I'll figure it out. Take care." RG Naomi stared at the message for a long moment, the weight of it settling into her bones. It wasn't an apology, not really. It wasn't even a promise, but it was something. A crack in the armor. A glimpse of the man Green used to be, or maybe the man he could still become. She debated whether to respond, her fingers hovering over the keyboard for a second longer than necessary. Then, finally, she typed 2 words. "You're welcome," she hit send, then let the phone fall into her lap, her gaze shifting back to the window as the cab merged onto the freeway. The city lights blurred past, streaks of gold and red and blue against the darkening sky. Naomi closed her eyes for a brief moment, letting the hum of the car's engine lull her into something close to peace. It wasn't about winning. It had never been about that. Some battles weren't meant to be won. They were meant to be fought over and over until the tide began to shift, until something, however small, began to change. And maybe, just maybe, tonight had been one of those nights. Months had passed since that flight, and Naomi had almost forgotten about the encounter. Life had continued at its usual relentless pace, long shifts at the hospital, emergency surgeries, the constant weight of responsibility pressing against her shoulders. The days blurred together, filled with the familiar rhythm of exhaustion and purpose, the quiet satisfaction of knowing she was doing what she was meant to do. She had moved on, or at least she thought she had, until the letter arrived. It was late in the evening when she found it, buried between a stack of hospital correspondences and unopened bills. The envelope was thick, the paper slightly rough to the touch, the kind of stationery that felt deliberate, chosen with care. There was no return address, just her name, written in bold, almost hesitant script. Naomi frowned, curiosity stirring as she tore it open and unfolded the pages inside. The handwriting was neat but slightly uneven, as if the writer had taken great effort to steady his hand, to make sure every word was written with intention. "Dr. Carter, I don't know if you'll remember me, but I'd be surprised if you didn't. I've been carrying our conversation with me since that flight, and I'm ashamed to admit it took me far too long to write this. I suppose I wasn't sure what to say, or whether I even had the right to say it. But I've learned that waiting for the right words is just another excuse to say nothing at all. So here I am, saying what I should have said long ago. You were right. About a lot of things. About James. About me. About what I let happen, what I chose not to fight for. I've spent years convincing myself that I was the kind of man who stood for something, who defended what was right. But the truth is, I only defended what was convenient. It was easier to look away, easier to let the world stay as it was than to question whether I was part of the problem. But that night on that flight you made me look, and I haven't been able to stop looking since. I started reaching out. First, to James's family. It took me weeks to track them down, and when I finally did, I wasn't sure what I could possibly say that would matter after all these years. But they didn't want an apology. They just wanted to know someone remembered him. That he wasn't just another name lost in the void, another soldier buried in history with no one left to speak for him. So I told them everything, every story, every moment I could recall. I told them about the times he saved my life, the way he carried the weight of a country that refused to carry him back. I told them what he meant to me, even if I never had the courage to say it when he was still alive. They deserved to hear. And I needed to say it, but I didn't stop there. I went back through old military records, old letters, old reports that had been left to collect dust. I found others who served with us, men who still remembered him, who still spoke his name in hushed tones, as if saying it too loud might break something inside them. We started pushing, asking questions, demanding recognition for the man who should have received it decades ago. It's a slow process, and I don't know how much of it will ever see the light of day, but I've come to understand that fighting for something isn't about knowing you'll win. It's about knowing you can't stay silent anymore. I won't pretend I'm a different man overnight. Change doesn't work that way. But I am trying, and I owe that to you. Not because you lectured me, not because you shamed me, but because you made me see myself the way I really was. And once you see it, you can't unsee it. You have to decide whether you let it destroy you or push you toward something better. I don't know what kind of man I'll be in the end, but I know I don't want to be the man I was before that flight. That's a start, isn't it? I don't expect anything from you. I don't expect a response or forgiveness or even for you to think of me again. But I needed to write this, needed you to know that our conversation mattered, that you changed something, even if it was just one man. I thought you should know. Take care of yourself, Dr. Carter R.G. Naomi read the letter twice, then a third time, her fingers gripping the paper a little tighter with each pass. The air in her apartment felt different now, heavier, charged with something unspoken, something she wasn't sure how to name. She had spent years fighting battles like these, moments where her very presence was questioned, where she had to stand her ground against the weight of history pressing back against her. And most of the time, she never got to see what came after. She never got to know if the people she challenged, the people she forced to confront their own biases, ever actually changed. She just had to keep going, keep pushing forward, believing that somewhere along the way something had to give. And now, here was proof. A letter from a man who had spent a lifetime building walls, only to find himself standing in the wreckage of them, trying to figure out what to build next. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution, but it was something, a shift, a crack in the foundation of something unmovable. And sometimes, that was enough. Naomi exhaled slowly, setting the letter down beside her on the desk. Her gaze flickered to the small drawer where she had tucked away the business card Green had given her that night, the one she had never decided what to do with. For the first time, she considered picking it up. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, she knew that something had changed, and that was enough. Naomi read the letter twice, then a third time, her fingers gripping the paper a little tighter with each pass. The air in her apartment felt different now, heavier, charged, with something unspoken, something she wasn't sure how to name. She had spent years fighting battles like these, moments where her very presence was questioned, where she had to stand her ground against the weight of history pressing back against her. And most of the time, she never got to see what came after. She never got to know if the people she challenged, the people she forced to confront their own biases, ever actually changed. She just had to keep going, keep pushing forward, believing that somewhere along the way something had to give. And now, here was proof. A letter from a man who had spent a lifetime building walls, only to find himself standing in the wreckage of them, trying to figure out what to build next. It wasn't redemption. It wasn't absolution, but it was something, a shift, a crack in the foundation of something unmovable. And sometimes, that was enough. Naomi exhaled slowly, setting the letter down beside her on the desk. Her gaze flickered to the small drawer where she had tucked away the business card Green had given her that night, the one she had never decided what to do with. For the first time, she considered picking it up. Maybe she would. Maybe she wouldn't. But either way, she knew that something had changed, and that was enough. Naomi sat in silence for a long time after reading the letter, her fingers still resting lightly on the edges of the worn paper. She had spent her entire career pushing forward, proving herself, standing firm in spaces where she wasn't always welcome. She had seen injustice, had felt the sting of bias in ways both overt and subtle, had grown used to the quiet exhaustion that came with constantly having to justify her presence. And yet, in all those years, she had rarely seen what came after. Rarely did she witness the shift, the slow unraveling of ingrained prejudice, the moment when someone like Colonel Green realized they had been wrong, not just in their words or actions, but in the very foundation of how they saw the world. It was easy to dismiss people like him as lost causes, to believe that those who harbored hatred or bias would never change. And in truth, many never did. Naomi had faced too many of them, men and women who clung to their ignorance like armor, who would rather burn bridges than rebuild them. But Green's letter had proven something else, something she had always hoped for but rarely witnessed. People could change, not all of them, not easily, not overnight. But it was possible, and that, in itself, was worth something. The battle against prejudice wasn't won in grand gestures or sweeping victories. It was won in moments like these, in uncomfortable conversations, in unexpected confrontations, in the quiet realization that someone had been forced to see themselves in a way they never had before. The cracks in their certainty widened, and, for the first time, they questioned whether the version of the world they had always believed in was the right one. Some ignored it, buried it, refused to acknowledge it. But some, like Green, sat with it, let it fester. And eventually, they did something about it. Naomi knew better than to assume Green had fully changed. People didn't undo a lifetime of beliefs in a single conversation, nor in a single letter. But the fact that he had written to her at all, that he had taken the time to reach out, to admit he had been wrong, to make amends in his own way, that was the kind of progress she could believe in, the kind that was real, the kind that mattered. She had learned long ago that fighting for justice, for equality, wasn't about instant gratification. It wasn't about forcing people to change in the moment, but about planting seeds. Some would never grow, lost in soil too poisoned to ever nurture something new. But others, like Green, might in time take root. And that was why she kept going. That was why she never backed down, even when it was easier to walk away. Change was slow, change was exhausting, but change was possible. And that made the fight worth it. Now, we turn the question to you. Do you believe people can truly change, even after a lifetime of prejudice? Have you ever had a conversation that made you see the world differently? Comment below and share your thoughts. And if you believe in standing up for what's right, in challenging injustice wherever it appears, don't forget to like, subscribe, and share this story with others. Because conversations like these matter. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next one. Stay strong, stay kind, and never stop pushing for a better world.